There was a time when humanity owned almost nothing. No houses, no fields, no borders, no cities. A family could wake beneath the same stars tonight and be hundreds of miles away a few weeks later. For most of human history, this was normal. People moved because food moved. They followed herds across grasslands. They gathered fruit when it ripened. They searched riverbanks for fish and shellfish. They knew the landscape in ways few modern people ever could. A particular tree could mean food. A particular rock could mark a reliable source of water. A change in the wind could signal approaching weather. Survival depended on paying attention. And for thousands upon thousands of generations, this way of life worked. Then something began to change. Not with a war, not with an empire, not with a king, with a seed, a tiny seed falling into the earth. It was an ordinary event, but humans had been watching plants for generations. They knew that certain grasses appeared after the rains. They knew that berries returned to the same places. They knew that animals followed seasonal patterns. Eventually, somewhere in the ancient Near East, people began doing something different. They stopped merely collecting plants. They began encouraging them. And once humans learned that food could be grown where they wanted it, the relationship between humanity and nature changed forever. This transformation is known as the agricultural revolution. But calling it a revolution can be misleading. There was no single morning when a hunter picked up a handful of seeds and suddenly became a farmer. The change unfolded slowly, over generations, perhaps even centuries. Wild plants were gathered. Some had larger seeds. Some were easier to harvest. Some grew in places where people returned year after year. Humans kept choosing the plants they preferred. They gathered their seeds. They scattered them again. And without realizing it, they were changing the plants themselves. Nature was no longer acting alone. Human choices had entered the process. The fields that eventually emerged were not simply natural landscapes. They were landscapes shaped by memory, labor, and repeated decisions. But agriculture demanded something in return. It demanded staying. A hunter could leave when resources became scarce. A farmer could not simply abandon an entire field because the season had gone badly. Seeds had been planted. Animals had to be cared for. Crops needed water. Harvests had to be protected. The future suddenly mattered in a completely different way. A wandering family carried what it needed. A farming community had to store what it would need months from now. This created a new relationship with time. People began planning for seasons they had not yet seen. They began saving food for winters that had not yet arrived. They began preparing for droughts, floods, and years when the harvest might fail. The future had become part of everyday life. And that changed human behavior. A permanent home became valuable. A storage pit became valuable. A field became valuable. Land itself began to acquire a new meaning. For the first time, people had something they could lose, and that created new possibilities, but also new dangers. Imagine a small settlement thousands of years ago. There are no streets, no towers, no written laws, only simple houses gathered close together. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Children move between the buildings. People carry baskets filled with grain. Nearby, fields stretch across the landscape. It looks peaceful. But life here is not necessarily easier. Farmers work for long hours. They dig, plant, weed, harvest, carry, store. Then they begin again. A successful harvest can provide security. A failed harvest can bring hunger. A drought can destroy an entire year's work. A flood can erase a field within hours. The same land that provides food can also become a source of danger. And there was another problem. As people settled together, disease had more opportunities to spread. Humans who once lived in relatively small mobile groups were now living in larger communities. People shared water, shared living spaces, shared animals. Waste accumulated near settlements. New diseases could move from person to person with greater ease. Animals living close to humans introduced another source of risk. The agricultural world was bringing opportunity, but it was also bringing problems humanity had never faced on the same scale. And yet, people stayed. Why? Because agriculture offered something wandering could not easily provide. Predictability, not certainty, not comfort, but the possibility of producing more food in one place. And once a community could produce more food than it immediately needed, something extraordinary became possible. Not everyone had to grow food. Some people could become builders, potters, toolmakers, traders, warriors, priests, leaders, specialists. A society could begin dividing its work. And when labor became specialized, human communities could become more complex. This was one of the foundations upon which cities would eventually rise. But the story is not as simple as saying agriculture made everyone better off. For some people, life became harder. Human skeletons from early farming communities often reveal demanding physical labor. Teeth can preserve evidence of changing diets. Bones can reveal injuries. Archaeology shows that the transition to farming brought both advantages and costs. Humanity had gained control over food production, but it had also become dependent on it. And that dependence would shape the next 10,000 years. Because once people planted their crops, they had a reason to defend them. Once they stored grain, they had something worth stealing. Once they settled on land, they had somewhere worth conquering. And once communities grew large enough, a new question emerged. Who would control all of this? The answer would eventually create chiefs, kings, temples, armies, and the first cities. But before the first great civilization could rise, humanity had to build something much smaller, a village, and thousands of years before the great cities of Mesopotamia. Across the hills and valleys of the ancient Near East, the first permanent communities were beginning to take shape. Their world was changing, and humanity was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The age of the wanderer was ending. The age of the settlement was beginning. The first farmers did not wake up one morning and decide to build civilization. They were solving a much smaller problem. How do we make sure there is enough food tomorrow? That question sounds simple, but it changed almost everything. When people began cultivating plants, they had to understand the land in a new way. They learned when the rains arrived, which soil produced better crops, which seeds survived drought, which plants could be stored through winter. The landscape itself became a kind of calendar. A change in the color of the grass could signal the beginning of a season. The appearance of certain birds could mean rain was approaching. The movement of the stars could help people track the passage of time. Knowledge was becoming tied to a specific place, and that place was home. One of the most important changes was the domestication of animals. At first, humans hunted wild animals. Over generations, however, certain species began living closer to people. Dogs were among the earliest animals to form a lasting relationship with humans. The exact details remain debated, but the partnership between humans and dogs is ancient. Later came sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs in different regions. These animals provided meat, milk, hide, bones, and eventually, In some societies, labor. But domestication was not simply a matter of humans controlling animals. Humans were changing too. A settlement with animals had to provide food and protection. People had to care for them, watch them, breed them, protect them from predators. Human lives became increasingly connected to the animals around them. This relationship would eventually transform entire landscapes. Then came another invention: storage. It may sound less dramatic than the discovery of fire, but storage changed the balance of power. A hunter could carry only so much. A farmer could harvest far more food than one person could eat immediately. Grain could be dried, stored, protected, and saved for the future. A successful harvest could mean survival through winter. But stored food created another possibility: wealth. For the first time, a community could accumulate resources. And whenever resources accumulate, someone has to control them. Who owns the grain? Who decides when it is distributed? Who protects the storehouse? Who receives more? Who receives less? These questions may have existed long before the first written laws. They were the beginnings of social organization on a new scale. As settlements grew, not everyone performed the same work. Some people became skilled farmers, others specialized in making pottery, some shaped stone tools, others worked with bone. Some became traders, moving materials between distant communities. Obsidian from volcanic regions could travel enormous distances. Shells could move inland. Rare stones could cross entire regions through networks of exchange. People were no longer living only within the boundaries of their immediate settlement. They were becoming connected to people they might never meet. Trade created relationships. Relationships created networks. And networks carried more than objects. They carried ideas. A new tool could spread from one community to another. A new farming technique could travel with a migrating family. A religious tradition could cross a mountain range. Human culture was becoming increasingly interconnected, but larger communities also created new tensions. When dozens or hundreds of people live close together, disagreements become harder to avoid. Who owns a field? Where does one family's land end? Who gets access to water? What happens when two groups want the same resources? These questions had no easy answers. There were no modern courts, no police forces, no written constitutions. Communities had to develop their own systems of rules, customs, and authority. Some disputes could be settled through negotiation. Others may have required force. Over time, certain individuals gained influence. Perhaps they were respected elders, successful farmers, skilled hunters, religious specialists, or people who could organize labor and protect resources. Leadership began taking new forms. The seeds of hierarchy were being planted alongside the crops. Yet there was another transformation that happened inside the human body. Diet changed. For hunter-gatherers, food could vary enormously from season to season. Early farmers increasingly relied on a smaller number of staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, millet, maize. Different regions developed their own agricultural traditions. This provided calories, but it could also reduce dietary variety. Archaeologists can sometimes see these changes in ancient skeletons. Teeth can reveal repeated exposure to certain foods. Bones can show the physical stress of repetitive labor. And human remains can sometimes reveal periods of malnutrition or disease. The agricultural revolution was not simply a story of progress. It was a trade. Humanity exchanged one way of life for another. Freedom of movement for permanent settlement. Dietary variety for dependable staples. less dependence on the movements of wild animals, for greater dependence on crops and livestock, and perhaps most importantly, a life shaped by the land. Then something happened that would change the scale of human society. Population began to grow. A settled community could support more people in one place than a small mobile group in some environments. More people meant more workers. More workers meant larger buildings. Larger buildings required organization. Organization created authority. Authority required rules. Rules created institutions. And institutions would eventually create states. The road to civilization was beginning to appear. But it was not a straight road. There were setbacks. Settlements could be abandoned. Crops could fail. Climate could change. Diseases could spread. Communities could disappear. Some villages lasted for generations. Others survived only briefly. The archaeological record is filled with places where people built homes and then vanished. Yet somewhere beneath the ruins of these forgotten settlements was another transformation. People were beginning to build structures that were no longer simply shelters. They were building places for gathering, places for ritual, places that expressed identity, places that required cooperation on a scale that would have been almost impossible for a small wandering band. And then, in the hills of southeastern Anatolia, more than 11,000 years ago, people began building something extraordinary. Massive stone pillars, carved with animals, standing in carefully arranged circles. There were no cities nearby, no known writing, no kings, no great empire. Yet the builders had organized enough people to create monumental architecture. The site would eventually become known as Göbekli Tepe, and its existence would force archaeologists to reconsider one of the oldest assumptions about civilization. Perhaps people did not first build large monuments because they had cities. Perhaps gathering together helped create the communities that eventually became cities. The old story was beginning to crack, and beneath the soil, a new story was waiting to be uncovered. The story of the first villages, the first sacred places, and the moment humanity began building a world that no longer existed in nature. That story begins next. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not live in the world we know today. There were no highways crossing the landscape, no cities filling the horizon, no written language recording the names of rulers, no armies marching beneath banners. And yet, more than 11,000 years ago, people gathered on a limestone plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey and created something extraordinary. They carved enormous stone pillars. Some stood more than 5 meters high. They shaped them with stone tools. They covered them with images of animals, foxes, snakes, wild boars, birds, and creatures whose meaning we may never fully understand. These were not random stones. They were carefully designed structures. They required planning, labor, food, tools, and cooperation. The transition from mobile hunter-gatherer societies toward the first farming communities. First came agriculture, then permanent settlements, then surplus food, then social organization, then temples, then cities, then civilization. But Göbekli Tepe challenged that neat progression. What brought them together? We do not know. Archaeology can reveal stones, bones, tools, but it cannot always reveal the thoughts behind them. The builders left no written explanation. The landscape was becoming connected, and connected communities can change rapidly. People began experimenting with plants, wild wheat, wild barley. Thousands of small decisions accumulated. A seed selected here, a field cultivated there. The wild landscape began turning into a human-managed landscape. Collective knowledge built over generations. Yet there was no single birthplace of agriculture. Different societies developed food production in different regions and at different times. The agricultural revolution did not create civilization overnight. It created the conditions in which civilization could eventually emerge. Humanity was standing at the threshold. Behind it was a world of movement. Ahead was a world of walls. And once those walls appeared, human history would accelerate. Villages would become towns. Towns would become cities. Cities would begin competing for land, water, and power. And somewhere between two great rivers, a civilization would rise that would leave behind one of humanity's most important inventions: writing. But before we reach the first written word, we need to understand the people who lived in the first permanent villages. Their story begins with the first villages, and that is where our next chapter takes us. For thousands of years, the transformation continued almost unnoticed. Alongside the hunters, another way of life was taking shape. People who stayed. Their survival had become tied to a particular piece of land. That connection could be powerful. It could create identity. A place could become home. A field could become part of a family's inheritance. A house could be repaired. A storage room could be filled again. Human memory was beginning to take physical form. But perhaps the greatest change happened inside the human imagination. Farmers had to think about a future they could not see. A seed was placed in the ground long before its harvest. People had to believe that the future would exist. They had to invest effort today for a reward months later. They had to plan, wait, protect, hope. That way of thinking would become fundamental to civilization. Civilization depends on people believing in things that do not yet exist. Agriculture trained humanity to think that way. The first farmers could not see the future they were creating. They did not know that their fields would eventually lead to towns. They were simply living, planting, harvesting, building, trying to make tomorrow a little more secure than today. But their choices had consequences far beyond their own lives. They had changed the relationship between humanity and nature. They had changed the meaning of land. And they had created the conditions for something humanity had never built before: a city. The wandering world had not completely disappeared, but another world was emerging beside it. A world of houses, fields, storage, trade, ritual, memory, and increasingly, power. The age of civilization was approaching. The age of wandering was ending. The age of villages had begun, and from those villages, the first cities would eventually rise.